Today we're going to talk about meter in poetry and ways to look at meter in order to kick your analysis up to the higher level that you're all aiming for. So the 7, the 8, the 9 on the AP scale. If you are a musician, if you've ever read music or play music, if you enjoy music, if you're a math person, I put a frowny face there because I'm not a math person, but if you are a math person and like regular patterns and counting, you might find scanning poetry a little bit easier. If you don't like any of these things, this lesson might be a little bit of a challenge, but stick with it. It will require some mental engagement, but it will make you a stronger analyst of poetry. So when we talk about scanning a poem, we mean determining the basic rhythm, so the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. You may have heard them as long and short syllables. We usually call them stressed and unstressed syllables. When we take this and apply it to literary analysis, we're looking at how the meter of a poem impacts its meaning. The meter doesn't always, so it really depends on the context. So this is where we break away from math and music. Sometimes the meter does have an impact. Sometimes the poet just chose to use a certain meter because that's the sort of poem that he or she is writing in. So sonnets have certain meters that have to be done, etc. So how to determine meter? We'll come back to this slide. So first, you're going to count the number of feet per line. And second, you're going to determine a dominant pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. So first thing, count the number of feet per line. You may have analyzed Shakespeare in the past. Remember that Shakespeare uses a meter called iambic pentameter, and your teacher may have had you count all the lines in a Shakespeare play, not every single line, but most of his lines have 10 syllables. So if we count when, in, disgrace, with, fortune, and men's eyes, so that one's 10. We can count each of the syllables on these lines. Shakespeare is not perfect. No poet is perfect. So there are some lines that cheat a little bit. So if you notice the third line, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, trips up a little bit. There's 11. But this is what I mean by counting feet. So a foot, and you should have a cheat sheet that goes along with this. A foot is one pattern of stress and unstress. So it depends on the type of foot you're looking for. Iambic pentameter, Shakespeare wrote iambic, which means unstressed and stressed. So we're looking for a pattern of unstressed stress. If you look at iambic pentameter, pent means 5. So if we have a pattern of unstressed stressed, that's 2 syllables, multiplied by 5, that's 10 syllables. So essentially every Shakespeare line should be 10 syllables. We need to stop and talk about stress. Not the kind of stress that you might be having right now when you're trying to figure out what in the heck a foot is in poetry, but the kind of stress, meaning emphasis, that you would put on a syllable. Think about any multiple word, any multiple syllable word, like your name. Any word that has more than one syllable will have at least one syllable that is naturally stressed. So think about your first name or your last name. Is there a word that's naturally stressed? My first name, Valerie. Usually the nickname, Val, comes from the stressed syllable. It would sound a little bit weird if I said Valerie or Valerie. It doesn't sound natural. So practice saying a couple words out loud that have more than one syllable. Look at the word pebble. What sounds natural? Pebble. What about sneaker? Sneaker. I don't say, do you have your sneaker today, right? I say, do you have your sneaker today? How about the word elementary? Elementary. We kind of blend the two T-A and R-Y together, but the M-E-N is what is emphasized. How about the word beautiful? I don't say you look beautiful today, right? I don't say you look beautiful today. I say you look beautiful. So if you look, every word has a natural stress. If you cannot find the emphasis yourself, if you can't hear it, you can look up each word in the dictionary, and the naturally accented syllable will be denoted by a little slash mark next to it. So here's some more examples of syllables. So the word poem. Poem. It's almost like we don't hear the EM at the end. Poetry. Same thing. The other syllables kind of blend in. The word relief. We hear leaf more than relief. Recommend. I don't say, can you recommend me? Can you recommend me? I say, can you recommend? Same with discomfort. Entertain. Entertainment. So remember, to determine meter, we have to first count the number of feet per line, and we have to determine a dominant pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. So we're looking at this Shakespeare example. Mostly, his lines have 10 syllables each. Then we have to determine a dominant pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. So I started with Shakespeare because you probably already know what the pattern is. You probably have talked about iambic pentameter with your English classes maybe in 10th grade or maybe earlier. So don't freak out. Instead, let's take a look at how to figure out stressed syllables in multi-syllable words. So the first thing, I see this line, when in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes. First of all, I have no idea what the line means, so I'm already freaking out. Secondly, I don't know where the stressed or unstressed syllables go, so I'm really freaking out. So first rule, don't freak out. Second rule, underline or identify any words that have more than one syllable. So in this line, the words disgrace and fortune have more than one syllable. So I'm going to underline those. I really don't have a choice. If a word has more than one syllable, the dictionary and the English language dictate which of those syllables is going to be stressed. So the word disgrace, I can't change it. It has to be the second syllable grace that's emphasized. The word fortune, I can't change the English language. For has to be emphasized. The other two syllables, the dis and the tune, kind of blend in. So that's the first thing I need to do. I need to identify any multi-syllable words and just mark the natural stresses and unstressed. The next thing that I need to do is try to find a pattern. So if I take that line, I've already marked disgrace and I've already marked fortune. I kind of fill in the rest and see if I can find a pattern. Anytime there's a one-syllable word, it can go either way. So when, the word in, with, and, men's eyes, they're one-syllable words. A lot of them are prepositions or minor words, conjunctions, so they kind of don't matter as much. They're usually unstressed, but it really just depends on the pattern. In this case, it's Shakespeare. We know it's iambic pentameter. We know the pattern is unstressed, stressed. Now, we wouldn't necessarily read it like this, but you could. When in, disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. You would say it naturally when you're reading it, but your voice would emphasize certain stressed syllables. When in, disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. So by now you probably see that there is a pattern to Shakespeare. And of course, I'm sure as we've already said, and as you remember from other classes, iambic pentameter. So iamb is unstressed, stressed, and pentameter means 5. So 5 iambs equals iambic pentameter. But that the main type of pattern is iambic pentameter doesn't mean it'll fit everything. Remember that in this quatrain, there's 10 syllables, 11 syllables, and 10. Let's do all the 10 syllable lines first. So see if it fits. Remember, iambic is unstressed, stressed. Does it fit? So when, in, disgrace, with fortune and men's eyes. It does. So we have 1 foot here, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Same thing with the second line. I all, alone. And remember, the word alone, the second part of that word is automatically stressed. And the same thing with beweep. Beweep. We don't have a choice. We can't change it. So we have 1 foot, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's skip the third line for now and go to the fourth one and look and think about the word upon. Upon. Upon is the stress syllable. Myself. Self is the stress syllable. So it fits beautifully. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So let's look at this last line that's left. And trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries. Trouble, trouble. We have trouble. Heaven, we have heaven. Bootless, we have bootless. So since this trouble is stressed and does fit in but then we have a problem because we have both deaf, but then heaven. So we have one iamb, we have a second iamb, 1, 2, and then heaven doesn't quite fit. And then with and my, they're both minor words, so they're both unstressed. We have bootless, and then cries at the end. What do we do with this? So we have one iamb, we have 2. I don't know what this is, I don't know what this is. Well, this is part of the point. Shakespeare has cheated a little bit, but the word heaven then stands out. It breaks the pattern. The reason that Shakespeare uses iambic pentameter, it does create a pattern. It's sort of like a human heartbeat. It's very rhythmic. But when he breaks that pattern, it makes things stand out. So the word heaven breaks that pattern. So what's important about heaven? Well, let's see. This guy feels like he's in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes. His life is not going really well. He's all alone and he's weeping for his state. He's an outcast. He's troubling deaf heaven. Heaven is deaf. So heaven, if you're calling to heaven and heaven is deaf, that's pretty sad. You're praying and no one is helping you. He wants the word heaven to stand out. So he breaks that iambic pentameter. With my, these are minor words. So boot does have to fit because bootless, we don't have a choice. So he uses heaven to throw off the whole pattern of this third line in order to emphasize the fact that even heaven is not helping this poor speaker. So when you look at scanning poetry and identifying stressed and unstressed, you want to see if there's any words that break the pattern. Now obviously during a 40-minute timed writing, you're not going to have time to scan the entire poem. But if you do notice something that stands out and can quickly find it, and then tell me something meaningful like, heaven stands out because it's showing the extent of this poor speaker's state, that's what's going to get you that level 8 and 9 score. So here's an example of a trochaic poem. If you look on your little cheat sheet, trochaic is the opposite of iambic. It's a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed one. So this is from Longfellow's poem, The Song of Hiawatha. If you read it out loud, you kind of, I know that I've highlighted and bolded and underlined certain words, but if you read it out loud, you're going to hear that your voice fits into a pattern. By the shores of Gitche Gumee, by the shining Big Sea water, stood the wigwam of Nokomis, daughter of the moon Nokomis. Do you notice what this sounds like? So we have the Song of Hiawatha. This tells us it's Native American. It's a song, so it's supposed to be rhythmic. Does this sound like a drum beat? In this case, the obnoxious insight that would get you the level 8 or 9 score is that the author used trochaic, stressed followed by unstressed, to replicate the sound of a drum beat that you might hear in a Native American drum circle. Here's an example of anapestic poetry. This is 2 unstressed syllables plus 1 stressed one. And this is a limerick. Limericks are usually supposed to be somewhat humorous. So, there was an old man with a beard, who said, "It is just as I feared. 2 owls and a hen, 4 larks and a wren, have all built their nests in my beard." In this case, the stresses that come at the end of the lines help to add to the humor of this. Most limericks, and some are not quite school appropriate, this one is, most limericks are meant to be humorous, and so that anapestic meter usually adds humor. Now, of course, it depends on context. If you were reading a poem and you recognized it was anapestic, but it was horribly tragic and sad, it's not necessarily adding to humor. So that's what makes this, again, different from math class. In math class, things are usually black and white. In poetry analysis, you need to know the rules. They're kind of like the tools, but knowing each tool only does you any good if you also know the context of the poem. So everything needs to be analyzed underneath the umbrella of the context of the poem. Here's an example of a dactylic poem. one stressed syllable followed by two unstressed syllables. This is called Charge of the Light Brigade. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death, rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said, into the valley of death, rode the 600. In this case, the stressed followed by two unstressed, it almost sounds like a gallop. Can you hear the horses? Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, galloping, galloping, galloping. So again, the obnoxious insight in this poem is that Tennyson used dactylic meter to replicate the galloping sound of horses, and it links to meaning because these soldiers are basically riding to their death. And so the form of the poem matches the content. We're always wondering, so what? So poets use the natural flow of phrases and clauses the same way they use punctuation. When we read a line of poetry, we find natural stopping points. This is why sometimes if you read a Shakespearean play out loud as a class, it sounds a little bit awkward because Shakespeare's language is not natural to us. The words are a little bit difficult, the diction, the syntax, and so it doesn't sound natural. But if we were reading a modern poem out loud with syntax and diction that we're used to, we would have natural pausing points. So poets can use end-stop lines where we pause either with a comma or a period at the end of each line. So here, a noiseless patient spider. I marked where on a little promontory it stood isolated, marked how to explore the vacant vast surrounding. It launched forth filament, 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 out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. I'm already told where I'm supposed to pause. So in this case, the poet sort of wants us to stop and contemplate. It seems like the speaker, I marked, remember we talked about marked in one of the poems that we read in Renaissance era, mark this in the flea. He said, mark this flea. He's saying pay attention. So a noiseless patient spider, I paid attention to where it stood. So this speaker is observing the spider. And so the pauses at the end of the line help us to understand that the speaker is being kind of contemplative. He's thinking about things. On the other hand, there's a term called enjambment. This is a poetry term in which the end of each line kind of continues on to the next line. You're not meant to stop. And a lot of times why reading Shakespeare out loud in class is so painful is that students naturally stop at the end of each line, whether there's a natural grammatic stopping point or not. So enjambment, if there's no punctuation at the end of the poem, it's assumed you're going to read through to the next line. So, sorrow is my own yard where the new grass flames as it has flamed often before, but not with the cold fire that closes round me this year. It's meant to just kind of fold in on itself. And in this case, sorrow is happening in this person's own yard. The rapid fire way that we're presented in information, so new grass, flames, cold fire, the speed that's built here and the pace kind of helps us to understand the meaning of the poem. So when you look at enjambment, when you look at end-stopped rhyme, or just end-stopped lines in general, think about how that might affect the pace. A lot of times that insightful 8 or 9 essay score will come when you can find a link between the poetic techniques and the meaning. So just reviewing what rhythm versus meter is. Meter, we're just talking about math. It's the factual pattern of a poem. For Shakespeare, iambic pentameter. The rhythm is the flow of sounds. You can use meter to create rhythm, and that's really what you want to look at when you're analyzing poetry. How does a poet use meter to create rhythm? So there's a couple kind of rules of thumb, but again, there's not a definite, I can't give you something to memorize. Like if you see iambic, it means this, because in poetry, the most important thing is the context of the poem. So the iamb, unstressed, stressed, usually represents a natural rhythm. In English, the English language, this is our most natural way to speak. The trochee, stressed, unstressed, gives a feeling of pressing forward, of more urgency. So if we're using trochaic, there's probably something urgent about the poem. So, charging down the King's Pass steady, on to meet our death charge ready. This is not a calm poem. They're meeting death. So, anapestic, or trochaic rather, the stressed, unstressed, it breaks the typical pattern of English. It's not relaxed, it's not natural, it's very insistent, so this links to the meaning. In this example, the anapest is used for galloping, as I mentioned. It's a galloping kind of rhythm, but in this case, let's look at the context. There once was a fellow at Drew who spotted a mouse in his stew, told the waiter about it, who said, "Well, don't shout it, or the rest will be wanting one too." In this case, it's comic, and so the galloping rhythm kind of adds to the comic nature of the poem. But if people are galloping to their death, again, the context would be totally different. So that's the main point that I want you to understand. Context is important. So finally, we're going to look at this poem, Virtue, by George Herbert. When scanning a poem, remember, you first want to read it normally and think about where the accents fall. You don't want to just jump in and try to assign accents anywhere. If you're stuck, look at multi-syllable words for clues. So in Virtue, lines 2, 3, 8, 10, 12, and 14, they're easy to identify. And look at multi-syllable words, tonight, compacted, we can't change, timber, seasoned, never. We're not allowed to change the English language. We have to follow in multi-syllable words where the stress falls. So for example, use the word compacted to determine where the stress falls. So it has to be here. And then think about in words that have, lines that have only one syllable words, what word seems most important? In line 4, thou and die are the most important, so it's easy to stress them. Other tricks if you're getting stuck, nouns usually, again, not always, but usually receive more stress than adjectives. Verbs usually receive more stress than adverbs. The only difference would be if the author really wants to make the adjective stand out. If the author really wants to make the adverb stand out. So again, most poets cheat a bit. Virtue is mostly iambic tetrameter, but there are some exceptions. Sweet rose, okay, that fits. Unstressed, stressed. Whose hue? Unstressed, stressed. Angry. We can't change the word angry. This is a rule of English. The first syllable is stressed. And brave, so this fits. Angry stands out. Remember that Shakespeare line that we looked at, heaven stood out. So what's the so what? The word angry is acting, well, it's acting angry. It stands out by rebelling against the iambic pattern. And so we need to be looking at why that is. What does this poem mean, and why would angry be standing out? Look at this. Bids the rash gazer wipe his eye. Bid stands out as well. There's some more irregular lines. Only. We can't change the English language. This is not an iambic word, and yet this iambic poem starts with it. Virtuous. There's a little bit of cheating here. When there's words that have more than one syllable, as long as we accent the correct syllable, we can sometimes cheat, and we can kind of blend two syllables together. So virtuous, it's almost like chuis. We put it into one syllable. So then we have sweet spring, that's iambic, all right. Full of. If I'm looking at both single syllable words, how do I know full should be emphasized? Well, of is a preposition, it's not really important. Full is the stronger word. So if I read that full of, that just sounds kind of weird. So full is meant to be stressed. Sweet days, that kind of works. And rose, and then there's just an extra syllable at the end. Same thing with the last line, there's an extra syllable at the end. So you're probably thinking, well, why should I care? I don't care about this. Okay, using meter and breaking that meter can impact the meaning. So let's look at this. The structure of the poem Virtue, 3 parallel stanzas. These are all about things that die. The 4th stanza is about one thing that doesn't die. The first 3 stanzas begin with sweet, followed by an iambic pattern. The last stanza begins with only, and this disrupts the pattern and it disrupts the content. The meter reverses at the beginning of this last stanza, and so does the message. So in this case, the message, again, is being reinforced by the format of the poem. You might be thinking, man, this is obnoxious. How can people even tell this? The more you practice it, the easier it'll get. And this lesson was modified from a college textbook. So these are professors, people with nothing else to do except analyze poetry. So don't freak out if you're not seeing this right away. But I promise you that several of you over the course of the year are going to notice this in poetry, and your writing's just going to fly. So some more things to observe in this poem Virtue. The 4 short lines perfectly fit iambic meter. the rhythm created is almost violent. It's almost like a crescendo. For thou must die, and thou must die, and all must die, then chiefly live. Do you see how the crescendo is kind of building up, and then chiefly live? It kind of takes away from the violence of it. Think about how that affects the meaning. What is the one thing the poet's saying doesn't die? All right, here's something else that someone with a lot of time on their hands found. Look at all the two-syllable words in the poem. When isolated from their lines, let's just make a list, they would all be trochaic. Bridal, angry, gazer, ever, roses, music, closes, season, only, timber, never, chiefly. And I'm artificially stressing the first syllable just to prove the point. They all start with an accented syllable. But because of how they are arranged in the iambic structure, only two stand out to break the meter. Everything else is fit nicely so that they can still have their accent where the accent belongs in the word, but they still fit the meter. Angry and only are the ones that break that iambic pattern. So in this case, angry goes against the sweet tone of the first three stanzas, and only becomes the exception to the poet's rule that most things must die. So once again, the poet is breaking meter and playing with meter and rhythm in order to emphasize his message. Couple of closing thoughts. The first is a poet's merit, how good a poem is or not, it's not judged based on a strict adherence to meter. So just because a poet can write the whole thing in iambic pentameter doesn't mean it's a good poem necessarily. Sometimes it's the poet's ability to break that meter that helps add to the meaning. Now you will get poets who just pick a type of poem, like a sonnet that's usually written in iambic, or some other type of poem, and they'll simply use that style because they want to write a sonnet. If they don't break the rules, there's not a whole lot you can say about meter, unless the meter really does replicate the mood or the feeling of the poem. The effects of rhythm and meter, they're multiple and they're varied. What this means is I cannot give you a chart that says if it's iambic, it means this. If it's trochaic, it means this. It really does depend on the context of the poem, and it could even depend on the stanza that you're looking at. Rhythm can be used to have a heightened emotional awareness of what's happening in the poem. When these soldiers are galloping to their death, the rhythm of that poem makes us feel like we're galloping. The words just kind of bleed into one another, just the same way you can imagine a horse galloping down a hill into a battle, terrified of what's coming. A poet does and can adapt the sound of the verse to mirror or reinforce the meaning, and that's really what you want to look for. In English, there's no meter that's automatically happy or sad. Again, it's context dependent. And so, what you need to do, this is the takeaway lesson, you should look at meter if you're able to, but you can't look at it isolated. You have to look at it along with other elements of the poem. So I hope that you found some insight and that you can start to apply this to your analysis of poetry. Don't freak out if you can't. Don't waste too much time trying to scan a poem when you could be looking for other literary devices if it's a timed writing situation. If you can find it, awesome. If not, do what you can with meter and move on to another device. But while we're doing all these practices in class, these are things that I want you to look for because it will make you a strong writer.